Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marjorie Fuller, and I'm the director of the Center for Black Culture and Research here at West Virginia University. And I am pleased to be doing the introduction for Ms. Deesha Philyaw. Deesha is an American author, columnist, and public speaker. She was born in Jacksonville, Florida, and currently lives right around the corner from us in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She received her undergraduate degree at Yale University and her master's degree at Manhattanville College. Her debut short story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, was a finalist for the 2020 National Book Award in Fiction and is a finalist now for the Story Prize. Deesha is also a Kimbilio Fiction Fellow and a past Pushcart Prize nominee for essay writing in Full Grown People. She is also the co author of Co Parenting 101, Helping Your Kids Thrive in Two Households After a Divorce. She published this in collaboration with her ex husband. Her work has been listed as notable in the Best American Essays series, and her writing on race, parenting, gender, and culture has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, McSweeney's, The Rumpus, Brevity, Harvard Review, ESPN's The Undefeated, The Baltimore Review, Ebony Magazine, and countless others. Tara Campbell, author of Midnight at the Organporium from Barrel House Magazine, says, "This is no mere collection of sappy romance stories. The love in Philyaw's stories runs the gamut from sweet to bitter, sexy to sisterly, temporary to time-tested, often with hidden aspects. The word secret in the title is earned, and some of the secrets are downright juicy. And we are downright thrilled to have her here with us today. So without further ado, I introduce and present to you Miss Deesha Philyaw.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. I'm so glad to be here. I want to start first by saying good afternoon and thanks to everyone who has joined. I want to also give thanks to my ancestors, those known and unknown. Thank you again to Marjorie and to everyone at the West Virginia University Center for Black Culture and Research for inviting me to speak in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is my first time speaking at WVU, but I feel right at home here, thanks to my friends at West Virginia University Press, who in 2019 read a partial manuscript of The Secret Lives of Church Ladies and believed that it could become a book, a full collection of stories about Black women, sex, and the Black church. I thank Director Derek Kristoff, who's here, who I can see in the Zoom audience, and everyone, the whole staff at the press, for having a vision for my book and for so lovingly and thoughtfully ushering it out into the world and celebrating it. Every writer should be so fortunate as to have the kind of publishing experience that I've had. So now I'm going to say what you may be thinking. What in the world does The Secret Lives of Church Ladies have to do with Dr. King's life and legacy? What does it have to do with justice and equity? And can I talk about it for 40 minutes? So I had to ask myself these questions upon receiving the invitation to speak today. And because I like a challenge, I accepted the invitation before having an answer to these questions. So I decided to approach the questions the same way that I approach writing stories, like solving a math problem, a bit of trial and error, asking myself, what if, and seeing where it leads, trusting myself, trusting the reader, or in this case, the audience, to make connections and to come away at the end of the story a bit less comfortable, a bit less complacent than before. So I will have succeeded if at the end of our time together today, I and all of you feel compelled to see and engage the world around us even a little bit differently. So the first connection I made between The Secret Lives of Church Ladies and Dr. King has to do with my earlier allusion to my publishing experience. A December 2020 New York Times opinion piece asked the question, just how white is the publishing industry? Some of us in the writing world had some idea of the answer to that question. We know that the ranks of publishing industry executives and staff, the gatekeepers, are overwhelmingly white. But what the New York Times article brought to light was the impact of this. The article revisited a Twitter hashtag from June of last year, hashtag publishing paid me. Using this hashtag, writers shared the advances they earned on their books, and the racial pay disparity was very quickly apparent. Even relatively unknown white writers received significantly larger advances than acclaimed Black writers who had a proven track record of publishing success. And those Black writers had to fight to get the advances that they got. The article also noted that while non-Hispanic white people are only 60% of US population, they wrote 89% of the books published in 2018. Further, the authors of the article looked at over 7,000 English language fiction books published by the major publishing houses between 1950 and 2018. Of those books, 95% were written by white people. And in 2020, 90% of the books on the New York Times bestseller list for fiction were written by white people. The New York Times article goes on to reveal how Black books and Black authors are sometimes pitted against one another. One anonymous publishing executive was quoted as saying in an acquisition meeting, "Do we need Angie Thomas if we have Jason Reynolds?" And in case you don't know, both Angie and Jason are Black YA authors. So this gives you some context for the publication of The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. Whose stories get published? Whose stories get promoted and marketed so that they have the best chance possible to find a wide audience? Who is making these decisions? What are their biases? Why does any of this matter? Besides the obvious issue of equity, there is also the issue of power, the power of story, the power of the narrative. In his book, 1984, George Orwell wrote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Let's unpack this. In our present moment, those entities who control the dominant and prevailing narrative of what we are expected to believe and understand about the past, those entities are determining our future. This is the power of narrative. This is why it matters which stories get told and who tells them. In our present moment, those entities who control the dominant and prevailing narrative of what we are expected to believe and understand about history, those entities are determining our future. This is happening right now in Washington, D.C. This has been happening for all of recorded history. It has been happening since enslaved Africans were captured and brought to the Caribbean and to a place that would become known as the United States of America. How do you justify enslaving human beings and treating them as chattel? You put forth the narrative that these beings aren't actually human. How do you justify the rape of women? You put forth the narrative that they are property, not women. You put forth a narrative full of stereotypes like Jezebel or Mammy that deem these women either hypersexual or completely asexual. You put forth narratives that ultimately render these women unrapeable to justify raping them. This is the power of narrative. This is why it matters which stories get told and who tells them. This is why we must disrupt the old narratives that persist from the past into the present. This is why it was important to me to write a book of stories that tell the truth about who Black women are and that place us at the center of our own lives. The center, not at the margins of a white savior story like The Help or countless other narratives that I could name that position Black women beneath the white gaze, a gaze that writers Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Gloria Naylor, Toni Cade Bambara, Audre Lorde, and Gail Jones pushed back against. In The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, the only gaze is ours. In our present moment, those entities who control the dominant and prevailing narrative of what we are expected to believe and understand about justice, those entities are determining our future. This has been happening since 2016, when the dominant and prevailing narrative put forth by mainstream media and by many of our elected officials was a narrative that refused to acknowledge that the embodiment of white supremacy had been installed in the White House. It's the narrative of Black Lives Matter protesters as rioters versus the narrative of white supremacist terrorists as misunderstood or upset about the economy. It's the narrative that reduces the Confederate flag to a symbol of a vague concept of heritage and not the battle flag of bloody treason and sedition. It's the narrative in which 12-year-old Tamir Rice is shot and killed by a Cleveland police officer within 2 seconds of the officer getting out of his police car. The officer was later fired, but the shooting was deemed justified and he was not charged. It's the narrative of 19-year-old Dylan Roof being taken into custody alive after killing 9 Black parishioners at a Baptist church in Charleston. These disparate narratives about who is and isn't dangerous fueled a domestic terrorist attack literally in the halls of our government last week. This is the power of narrative. This is why it matters which stories get told and who tells them. Over the next week, as the nation celebrates Dr. King, the narrative of his life and his words will be distorted as they are every year. Some folks love the out of context Dr. King who preached nonviolence and had a dream. The radical Dr. King who called for accountability and economic equality and justice and political power, not so much. Some folks will even weaponize Dr. King's words against those of us who challenge casual racism and bias and who seek to hold others accountable. I've had folks tell me that Dr. King would be disappointed in me for pointing out their racism, a failed attempt to shame me. I feel no shame. I simply realize at those times that I'm talking to someone who knows very little about Dr. King and that they're clinging to a narrative about him that is toothless, that is incomplete, that comforts them, that justifies their complacency and their complicity in white supremacy and the terrorism it feeds. This toothless narrative tells us that Dr. King died, that he was killed, an object with no subject, the telltale passive voice of unaccountability. And then there's the narrative that tells the truth, that Dr. King was assassinated precisely because he was a threat to the status quo, because he opposed the war in Vietnam, because he supported workers' rights, because he got tired of waiting, because he had become disillusioned with white moderates. In the coming week, you're not likely to hear this Dr. King, the one who spoke these words at Riverside Church in New York in 1967. Now, it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. It can never be saved so long as it destroys the hopes of men the world over. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor in America who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. And finally, Dr. King said, we are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the urgency, with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is the thief of time. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked, and dejected with a lost opportunity. The tide of affairs of men does not remain at the flood, it ebbs. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. There is an invisible book of life that faithfully records our vigilance or our neglect. The moving finger writes and having writ moves on. We still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. In the coming week, you're not likely to hear this Dr. King, the one who spoke these words in 1963 in his letter from a Birmingham jail. He wrote, I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exists for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace in which the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight to a substantive and positive peace in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with, like a boil that can never be cured so long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must be exposed with all the tension its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. For the present moment, a moment in which it is not hyperbolic to say that fascism is storming the barn door of our democracy, we must resist the narrative and allure of the negative peace that Dr. King warned us about. In that same letter from a Birmingham jail, he wrote this: I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. In the past 4 years, and as we have seen as recently as this week, our mainstream media and many politicians have pushed the narrative of a negative peace. Civility without accountability is a negative peace. Unity without justice is a negative peace. This is a dangerous narrative that calls for a gentle response to people who seek to destroy us. It has always been demanded of Black people in America that we be more civilized, more respectable than the people who seek to destroy us. For this reason, most of you have heard the narrative of Rosa Parks, but not that of Claudette Colvin. At age 15, Colvin refused to move to the back of the bus and give up her seat to a white person in Montgomery, Alabama. Colvin was arrested 9 months before Rosa Parks. She also became pregnant after her arrest. Civil rights movement leaders didn't think a pregnant teenager was the right symbol for their efforts. The dominant narrative of the civil rights movement has long relegated Black women to the margins of history and of their own lives. Rosa Parks wasn't only a seamstress. She was the secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, and her duties included investigating rape cases involving Black women. There are countless unsung women who did the heavy lifting of the civil rights movement, but who were not the face of that movement. The narrative of the movement and of this nation is incomplete if it does not include women like Georgia Gilmore, Ella Baker, Diane Nash, Mary McLeod Bethune, Dorothy Height, Joanne Robinson, Pauli Murray, Daisy Bates, Septima Clark, Fannie Lou Hamer, Shirley Chisholm, and Elaine Brown. Everywhere in the history of this country, Black women are there doing the heavy lifting. Most recently, we have Stacey Abrams, Latasha Brown, Sharice Davis, Nsé Ufot, and others to thank for mobilizing voters in Georgia, resulting in the wins we desperately needed there. Their names must be prominent in the narrative of the few bright spots we managed to cobble out of the nightmare that was 2020. Which brings me back to The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, which was definitely a bright spot for me and for others, I'm told. During my book tour, one interviewer sent me the questions in advance of our conversation. One of those questions had to do with the uprising happening around the world last summer in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and others. The interviewer asked, "Right now, we're experiencing a cultural flashpoint and the church is leading the way. What role do you see women in the church taking in that conversation moving forward?" And I have to tell you that never was I so happy to receive the questions in advance, especially because this was going to be a live interview. This gave me an opportunity to let the interviewer know that in fact, the church was not leading the way, not now. But I could understand the error to some extent. The Black church had been the cornerstone of the civil rights movement. And while the church's influence in progressive movements has waned in the decades since, the influence of the church's narratives about women, sex, and sexuality still reverberate in the larger culture. My collection of stories is as much about freedom as it is about sex. The evangelical church's obsession with sex and sexuality, and in particular control over women's sexual and reproductive lives, requires that any narrative about Black women getting free of the church's binaries and constrictions will have sex at the center of it. I wrote The Secret Lives of Church Ladies in the hope that Black women would feel seen and heard. Because Toni Morrison and August Wilson taught us that writing about Black people and Black life is not limiting and not limited because they taught us that you can tell universal truths about the human experience through specific stories about Black people. I knew that people who aren't Black women could also connect to these stories. I knew that they could, but I didn't know if they would. So I have been happy to hear from readers across race and gender and nationality who tell me that the stories and characters resonate with them personally and that they gained a fuller view of who Black women are. That too is the power of narrative. Some interviewers asked me what people in the Black church think about my book. Well, it depends on which people we're talking about. I assume there are some who aren't fans of the book, but I haven't heard from them. I have heard from some church folks that they love the book and that it sparked conversation among them and their loved ones or people at church. I love the idea of church folks talking about my book critically and engaging the ideas and questions it raises. I love the idea of the overwhelmingly female church body with overwhelmingly male leadership grappling with their long history of hypocrisy, misogyny, and queerphobia through the lenses of my stories and characters. I invite the church to grapple with my narratives. I hope that there are pastors who welcome questions from women like Caroletta in my story titled Eula, who says, people say you're supposed to put your faith in God, not men. Do you think God wants you or anybody to go untouched for decades and decades, for their whole lives? Like Sister Stewart, Sister Hill, Sister Wilson, my mother after my father died, all those women at church who think they have to choose between pleasing God and something so basic, so human as being held and known in the most intimate way. If God became human once, then why would he make rules that force such a painful choice? I hope there are Sunday school teachers who would have an open dialogue with 14-year-old Jael, my titular character, who has a crush on the preacher's wife, Sister Sadie. Jael writes about her in her journal. She writes, "It's something about the way her eyes sparkle and dance instead of trying to look all holy. Today at church, old Rev was talking about how you have to be saved and give up the sinful pleasures of the flesh if you want to get to heaven. Seem like saved folks don't like to do anything but talk about being saved, complain about sin, and go to church. And church be boring as hell, so I just watch Sweet Sadie and think about her sexy body and her secret past." I hope there are Bible study leaders who would engage both Tashida and Renee, two sisters in my story, Dear Sister, who disagree about the scripture that tells us to honor our fathers and mothers. I hope there are preachers willing to address the hypocrisy of godly cheating men like the ones in my story, Instructions for Married Christian Husbands, and men like Pastor Troy Neely in my story, Peach Cobbler, who preach fidelity and the sanctity of marriage from the pulpit while carrying on a decade-long affair with one of his parishioners, a secret to everyone except that parishioner's young daughter. I hope there are congregations who love like Jesus loved, who would welcome Arletha and Rhonda from my story Snowfall into their fold without any caveats about hating the sin and loving the sinner. I hope there are chaplains who would view my story, Not Daniel, as a story about grief more than as a story about infidelity. I hope there are church mothers who will read my story When Eddie Levert Comes and treat new members as more than just numbers of soul won for Christ, but as people in need of friendship. I hope there are church leaders who would welcome questions from Lyra, the main character in my story, How to Make Love to a Physicist. Lyra meets a physicist named Eric, and in this excerpt that I'm going to read to you, she's got questions for him. How do you make love to a physicist? Ask him if he believes in God. Ask him if he thinks it's possible to reconcile science and religion. Physics principles support the notion of God, Eric says, because they tell you that you can't create something from nothing. Something must have created all of this, unless you believe that we have always existed, that there's no big bang, no beginning point to the universe. I don't know what the mechanism is, but it's some higher power. All that energy had to come from somewhere. And then Lyra says, oh, I assumed you were an atheist. And Eric says, even Einstein wasn't an atheist. He talked about God all the time. Now, he didn't believe in a God that was concerned with human behavior, which is the church's obsession and the reason it uses guilt and shame to enforce Christianity. And Lyra says, you don't think God cares how we treat each other and the planet? And he responds, I think that's the most important thing, but human beings are capable of doing that outside of the purview of the church. I've studied the Bible cover to cover. So much hinges on translation and interpretation. I grew up Catholic and I love the ritual of it all, but I've come to understand that belief in a personal God is not essential, not for me. You ask, what about heaven? But what you really want to ask is, what about hell? What about it? Eric says. Heaven, getting into it, avoiding the alternative, is the whole point of living, right? Living right, isn't it? Your mother speaks longingly of Judgment Day and the final accounting of who's allowed past the pearly gates, certain that God's accounting will mirror hers. It will be a very small number, she's fond of saying. Only those who walk the straight and narrow path shall see the face of God. And you realize that if God were to welcome everyone into heaven, your mother would abandon Christianity immediately. You don't know how to answer Eric's question about heaven without sounding like you're quoting a fairy tale about good and evil, reward and punishment. You take a moment to soak it all in. You think of your mother and the small version of God she clings to, the only version you've ever known, the one you're afraid to let go of. Then you think of how your daily calls with Eric are a kind of ritual, and how when you finally meet up again, it could be a kind of consecration. You are thrilled and terrified at the prospect. Terrified because all you've ever known of religion is that it demands more than you can ever give. I guess a person could have heaven right here on earth, you say. I do, Eric says. Every time I see you smile or hear you talk about your students, and even when you're quiet and painting or just folding towels. Heaven is me folding towels? Okay, Eric says, maybe it's you folding fitted sheets. Miracles abound. This is my hope for new conversations and new narratives about Black women by Black women. And I'm thrilled to share that among the many book club conversations I've been invited to, there was one with a group of progressive Black women pastors, women who are daily rewriting the narrative about Black women, sex, and the Black church to be one that is healing, honest, and just. Finally, I want to talk about the narrative that started it all. The story of Adam and Eve, in which God places Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and tells them they have domain over all of it, but must not eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But as the story goes, Eve eats the fruit and encourages Adam to do the same. And it's been downhill ever since. Now, of course, more progressive Christian theologies and non-Christian religious traditions have different creation narratives. But we know that that prevailing narrative, the one that blames the downfall of humanity on the first woman, we know that this narrative has had and continues to have far-reaching consequences globally and for centuries. For the rest of my life, I'm committed to rewriting this narrative, especially as it pertains to Black women getting free. So I was especially excited to find Ansel Elkins' collection of poems, Blue Yodel, when I was searching for an epigraph for The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. The excerpt I chose from a poem titled The Autobiography of Eve reads, "I did not fall from grace. I leapt to freedom." In just 3 lines, with just 10 words, Elkins flips a dominant narrative in the human story. That is the power of narrative. And I think it's most fitting to close with a few final words from Dr. King's most famous speech, in which he quotes an old Negro spiritual: "Free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last." Thank you.
I think I speak for everyone, Deesha, when I say that was an amazing presentation, and we are so happy to have you here.
Thank you.
I am going to open it up, and people are clapping now. I'm going to open it up for questions at this point. You can type into the chat, and I will read the questions. Deesha also has access to the chat, and she is free to answer some questions that she feels are very pertinent to her book as well. I'm not just going to dominate the chat. I also want to tell everybody that we are doing a virtual book signing, and the first 25 people that email eric.jordan@mail.wvu.edu will receive a copy of Deesha's signed book. So that is fantastic. And I also want to thank Eric Jordan, who is our coordinator at the center, who has helped put together this virtual world that we're living in now for us so that we could have this fabulous speaker. So thanks, Eric. He's on, but I know he's somewhat hesitant to come on camera, but I want to make sure that everybody realizes that he is a definite foundation at our center, and I appreciate him more than he knows. So I see people are thanking. Are there any questions? I don't see any questions yet. Well, I will ask one while people gather their thoughts. Deesha, what was the inspiration other than just, the Black church and Black church women? Were there any ideas that you had prior to making the decision to write this book or experiences that you had that stood out to you that made you say, I have to write this book?
I wish that I had a story like that, but this book is a bit of a detour, actually. I started writing fiction about 20 years ago, and I really was focused on writing mostly about dissatisfied women. I really wasn't thinking of it in terms of sex or religion, but when I tapped into my memories and my nostalgia and all of those things, the church ladies were there. I grew up in churches, and I looked at those women the way I still look at Black women to see what's possible. But, when you're growing up and you're, adolescent or pre-adolescent, we look at others to see what's possible. And I remember the church women, and I remember being very curious about them. And so when I started writing about dissatisfied women, it was those women that I imagined. And so I started trying to write novels, and of the 3 I attempted over time, there was one that really had legs that I started in 2007, but I kept stalling for a variety of reasons. And then I started writing these short stories, and it was my agent who noticed the theme. She'd heard me read these stories, and she was very gracious and very helpful. And she said, while you're kind of on hiatus from that novel, what if you wrote a collection of these church lady stories? And that's when I got really intentional and saw that kind of through line that I hadn't really intended of Black women's sex in the Black church. And what does it look like when we try and get free of these things that have been, holding us back and keeping us from living truthfully. And so, I have women of different ages and different generations, and that was important to me. I would say in terms of my own experiences, I was not very conscious of it. I didn't say, well, I had this experience, I want to put it in the book. It was more just thinking about the different ways that I know that Black women try and get free. And so it was very organic that, queer women's stories showed up in this. It was very organic that, women's struggles with their mothers, that's something that's very organic. And so there's no story or character that's me, but I feel like I'm kind of sprinkled all throughout. Let's see, looking in the chat. Thank you, Maurice.
I got there's a question in the chat I can ask you.
Okay.
It said, in all the book clubs you've participated with, how many reflect full diversity, and do you have insights as to how those groups succeed in creating a diverse membership?
So for the book clubs, I'm pretty sure they've all been Black women. There was one book club that I recall that had a white member. But I'm not sure. I'm not a good book club person because I don't like other people telling me what to read. That's awful, I know. I tried to join a book club years ago, and I stayed for 2 books, and then I didn't like it after that. So I don't know. I don't know how people go about having it so that it's not so segregated. But we have no reason with social media, that you can just start a book club. I mean, I'm on Instagram, and there are all the bookstagrammers, and a lot of them are part of book clubs. I think if you're active on social media, it's pretty, even if you just go to my account and see who I'm following and who follows me, you'll find a lot of book folks, people who love books and love reading and love authors, and invite people and diversify your book club that way. Of course, I don't advocate inviting people as someone invited me to do something once. They invited me into an all-white space and said, and of course you'll be the diversity. So I don't recommend that. But just, genuinely casting a wide net. I try to share book club information that comes my way. Often book clubs will tag me on Instagram, and I've taken to sharing their posts and calling it, cool book club alert, and they're open to anyone to join. So I would say if your book club isn't active on social media, I would encourage you to get active. And I think that's a pretty easy way to end up with a diverse club. I hope that's helpful.
I think so. We have a question here from a colleague of mine at UNCW,
Okay.
the director of their center there, Mr. Sean Palmer. And he says, I love that you want the church to read the book. What ways do you want Black men to engage the texts, particularly Black male pastors?
So they have, which is really exciting. So there are a couple of ways that's happened. One of the early readers of this book, when it was a PDF, the advanced copy, was a Black male friend of mine who is, I think he just turned 40, and he's in Louisiana, and he's a farmer. He was not the person I had in mind when I was writing this book, but he just jumped right into it and found so many different connection points with it. And his reaction was so intense and so positive that I made a mental note at that point that I wanted to have a book club conversation for my book with just Black men, where I wouldn't even be present, but that somebody else would moderate it. And then as far as Black male pastors, I partnered with Frenchie Davis, who is a sex educator and sex abolitionist, just as the book was coming out. and we held a series of workshops that were about sexual freedom and sexual health, sex positive Christianity. And in our group of about a dozen attendees, we had two Black male pastors. And that was fantastic to hear, their perspectives on the book. And then finally, I have a friend who is a Black woman pastor. And when I was preparing for the launch of the book, and she knew I was working on a book club guide, she said, "Can you please create a guide that's for church folks?" She's like, pastors may want to teach this, but don't know how. So is there a way that you could create a guide just for them? And so I did that. So if you go to my Instagram account, and on Instagram, it's just my name, Deesha Philyaw, and there's a link there. And that link leads to a lot of other links. And you can find my book club guide. And you can find the second book club guide, which is for church groups. It has pretty much the same thing as the other guide, and it has an additional set of questions for church groups.
Okay, we have another question.
Okay.
He says, "I'm a 50-year-old Black man here. The story of jail," I think I pronounced that character right, "took my nerve, as they say, both with her age and how cold her heart can be at such a young age. What was your inspiration for such a character?"
The Bible. the biblical story of Jael is incredibly violent and so much so that when I didn't read it in the Bible first, I read about that story, and it really shook me. Because it's such personal violence. They're shooting somebody and then they're stabbing and and so, police will tell you that there's different, certain violence is more personal than others. And so that stuck with me, and I did what I do often, which is I save information. Maybe I might come back to it later. And so when I came back, and it was probably at least a year later, and I was building this collection, and I started playing that what if game. What if somebody gave a child that name? And what would that mean? Our names are powerful. And why would somebody give a child that name? And what if there was something murderous about her? And then I had to kind of problem solve from there and just sort of figure out, how do we get to that particular ending? But at the same time, I wanted to tap into some very real moments of Black girlhood and the things that many of us face, which is that the harassment that she and her friends faced, the violence, the prospect of very real violence. And so all of those things came together in Jael.
Are there any more questions?
I saw one that was asking about my daughter's reaction to my book. My daughters are very proud of me. I'm thankful for that. My older daughter is 22, and she asked me to give some of her friends copies of the book. So I've sent the book to her friends. But we haven't talked. I mean, they're familiar with the stories and things like that. But at the end of the day, I think I'm still their mom, and they're so used to me writing because I've been writing their whole lives. There's like excitement, and then they kind of wander off. It's like, oh, the National Book Award, that's great, Mom. And that's fine. We celebrate together, but we haven't had like in-depth conversations about the stories or anything like that. So. Thank you, Marilyn. Let's see some other questions.
Okay.
There's one that says, "My question is how to educate the white males in the workplace that is not sensitive to minorities, not sure of their religion, but I am really into my faith and feel harassed."
That's a heavy one. I think if I tie it to sort of the power of narrative, right? My first answer in terms of any kind of workplace harassment is, documenting it and reporting things. And it's kind of hard to answer this one without knowing more details. But I think that part of the problem is when we don't see each other's humanity, right? And, if you would ask most people who are, doing or saying racist things, they would say, of course, or even sexist things, of course I see, other people as fully human. But when it comes down to how we treat each other, that's not always the case. We don't treat each other the way we want to be treated. Unconscious bias is called unconscious bias for a reason, that there isn't an awareness of it. And we've done, corporate and workplace diversity training long enough to know that, the training alone isn't enough. We've moved from diversity to diversity inclusion to belonging to equity, to all of these words, but ultimately it's people having to see each other's humanity. First part. Second part, accountability, right? Some people don't do the right thing unless they're forced to, unless they have consequences. And so I think barring that, there's not a whole lot that we can do. But I know when I was in a workplace situation that was not, where I felt disempowered, part of it for me was writing my narrative, writing exactly what was happening and documenting things, and then having that even though I didn't get the justice that I needed, I still felt empowered by documenting it and making it part of the permanent record of my experience in that place. So I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful than that.
I have another question. I am an older church girl. I grew up in the church, and a lot of what you're talking about resonates very much with me. But how do you experience the difference between maybe people that fall in my generation, maybe the generation before me, those of them who are still living, and younger people? What do you see as the similarities in their response to your book and the differences?
Well, I will say that older women have completely surprised me, and talk about bias. Like, I was expecting, I don't know I wasn't expecting that. But I did have someone tell me, oh, I think my grandmother will really enjoy your book. And I said, oh, well, I'll send her a copy. And she said, oh, great, it'll be for her 80th birthday. And I was thinking about all those, sexting words in my book, and that, suddenly, I'm 12 years old again, and somebody's 80-year-old grandma is going to be reading my book. But I sent it to her, and she wrote me a card back, and she told me how much she loved it and how much she could relate to the stories. And it's like we have to take our own advice. There's a line in my book that's in Snowfall where it says, we have to think about the women they used to be. 80-year-olds weren't always 80, right? And so I think that that's the through line, that, all of us who are in adulthood, we all experience adolescence, so we do have that piece in common. And so I will say that older women have really surprised me. And I have also been delighted to hear about intergenerational conversations where women have said to me, I read this book with my mom, or my mom took this book off of my nightstand and wouldn't give it back. And we ended up having a conversation about things that happened to her that I'd never known about. And I'm, 30, 40 years old. So the intergenerational piece, I think it's connecting, the stories are a way to connect us and to see the ways that we are, have similar experiences, because I think we forget that they were younger ones. And I think that they forget sometimes what it was like, to be. And so sometimes that the seat of judgment and presumption for all of us, doesn't serve us. And so the stories have been a way to get people talking to each other and talking through some of those assumptions.
That's absolutely correct. I agree with that 100%. And I'm having those kinds of conversations with my daughters, especially now that they're getting older. And pieces like yours do kind of open the door in a way to certain conversations that you ask yourself, Do they need to know that? You know,
Yeah.
are there any other questions, Eric?
Nope, I think that was the last one.
That was the last question. Well, we are just about right on time. I do want to reiterate how absolutely delighted we are that you were able to join us today.
Thank
And
you.
we hope that we can bring you back again. That
I'd
would
love
be
that.
wonderful. That would be great. And so, to all of you out there, thank you so much for coming and being a part of this conversation. If you would like a copy of the book, please email us and we'll make sure that you get one. And if you're not one of the first 25 people to sign up, I would still suggest that you reach out to WVU Press and order The Secret Lives of Church Ladies because it's an amazing read. Thank you, Deesha. Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Eric.
Marjorie.
And thank all of you again. And we hope to see you soon.
Bye. Thanks,
Bye
Eric.
bye.
Thanks, everyone.